What we are focused over here is looking at climate risk, because climate risk is going to be the primary challenge that businesses across the world is going to face, or if not, they're already facing. So it does throw up a lot of risks and opportunities for investors and for the businesses to tap into, to manage and to tap into. So what CRFC aims to do is to make climate risk easily understood, uh, better managed, and to deliver some kind of solutions that will be easy to implement for the banking and the investing community to measure, monitor, and manage climate risk, and identify opportunities that climate risk will throw up. So what we, as a mission, we have a three-pronged approach. What we aim to do is to provide thought leadership in perceiving climate risk and its impact on financial institutions, to compile and develop resources for climate change mitigation and adaptation, to develop philosophical foundations and practical tools to implement climate-related financial risk management in financial institutions. So towards that end, we have been conducting weekend webinars since last year, and we invite specialists and practitioners in the field who understand climate risk, who understand the processes involved in monitoring and managing it, and also these newer terms or newer trends that are somehow connected with climate risk, especially with ESG and net zero targets and pathways. So this evening we have with us Mr. Andrew Isle. Mr. Andrew Isle is the head of the climate risk at TCS. He is part of the emerging risks team in the risk and compliance practice at Tata Consultancy Services in USA. He is based out of New York City. Mr. Isle's skills and knowledge include climate risk management and disclosure, sustainable finance, energy policy, climate finance, climate change adaptation and resilience, and holds certificates relevantly with GARP, Sustainability and Climate Risk certificates, SASB Fundamentals of Sustainability Accounting, and holds a level 2 candidature of the CFA with him.
Thank you, Siddharth, and a pleasure to be joining you. Very excited to be joining the Climate Risk and Finance Council today. And as you mentioned, I do work in the climate risk space. I lead the climate risk advisory practice in the North America geography for TCS. And in that capacity, as well as previously in my career, working in climate risk, climate markets, and climate finance, I've been grappling with these issues of how climate change impacts the financial sector as well as the real economy. And so it's my pleasure to share with you all today a discussion of this most important topic of how climate risk management tools can help us better understand the issue that we're facing, this multifaceted climate risk question, and how those can be brought to bear specifically for the risk management function through these emerging new approaches of scenario analysis, among others. So as has been mentioned, we will be focused today looking specifically at the scenario analysis question and scenario planning as an approach to manage uncertainty around climate-related events and climate impacts. And I will speak towards the end about the approach of scenario construction using narratives that can help improve readiness and resilience. But recognizing that our audience may have a varied range of familiarity with scenario analysis and scenario planning, I would like to start my presentation with some basic building blocks, which are not to be assumed even by experts, because there's a lot of tricky terminology and methodology here that I'd like to unpack. And so I'll start by introducing some key concepts around climate risk and scenario analysis. And then I'll go into some current approaches to how scenario analysis is broadly practiced amongst the financial industry and by regulators and financial overseers. I'll talk specifically about how scenario analysis can be used to manage uncertainty around climate-related issues. And then I'll get to this question of narrative-based scenarios, which is a relatively new area, and one that I believe is going to increasingly be prominent in the scenario analysis space. And then, of course, we will leave time at the end, as Siddharth mentioned, for some concluding remarks, and particularly for Q&A, as I'm eager to engage with you all in the audience. So getting started with the key concepts. It's, I think, important to contextualize this discussion to recognize that climate risk is indeed at the forefront among risks that are facing the financial sector and society at large. At least there's a growing consensus that that is the case. So Siddharth mentioned that at the top of the hour. That, of course, is subject to debate, but I did think it was worth bringing to bear here the results of the most recent World Economic Forum Global Risk Report, which was released last month. It's a survey of decision makers, business executives, leading government officials, and other experts, asking them to identify what they believe are the most prominent risks facing society on the 2-year and the 10-year timeframe. And we can see here on both of these timescales, anywhere you see green on this table is where you have climate or nature-related risks, and they are very prominent both at the top and throughout these lists. Climate action failure, extreme weather, biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse are on the top 4 spots in the 10-year timeframe. Environmental damage and natural resource crises are also in the top 10. Similarly, climate issues are represented on the 2-year timeframe, many of the same. And the report that came out last month really emphasized the need for improved readiness and resilience and risk management practices, which is fundamentally what this scenario analysis work is meant to help support. So I think that's something that really animates me personally, and I believe is why this issue is worth so much of our attention. For a moment, I'd also like to explain what climate risk is and what some of the pathways are for propagation of climate risk into the real economy and into financial risk. So I'll be very brief here. So I do apologize both to those who are very familiar with this and to those who may be encountering this for the first time. It's hard to cover this in the right amount of detail for a varied audience, but climate risk generally breaks down into 2 types of risk drivers. One is physical risk, which are weather and climate-related phenomena in the natural world that can be either acute, as in they are one-time events that occur over, say, days to weeks, versus also chronic hazards that accrue and accumulate over time. So those include things like storms, floods, precipitation events, droughts, hurricanes, and then you also have longer term events such as temperature rise, sea level rise, desertification, and so forth, that all contribute to impacts, often negative impacts, on ecosystems, on human society, on health and well-being, on things like that. Those are physical risks. On the transition side, you have all of the aspects of society's response to the climate change challenge, much of which is focused on reducing emissions. Our greenhouse gas emissions, which are the fundamental cause of climate change, are so deeply embedded in our economy and in our society to bring those down to levels commensurate with our climate goals of limiting warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees really is going to require a revolution in many aspects of human society. And so that upheaval, be it in markets, in consumer behavior, in government regulation, policy, technology adoption, all those things are likely to accelerate as society accepts and tackles this challenge. And so those transition aspects of society addressing climate change are collectively referred to as transition risk. And all of those, because they are so broad and sweeping in their scope, they tend to permeate most aspects of financial markets, the economy, and society in some shape or form. And so those can have impacts on business and on the economy in terms of revenues, costs and expenditures, impacts on assets and liabilities, as well as access to capital and financing. And in terms of the risk management practice in financial institutions, or more widely in corporates and for regulators, these risks manifest as other kinds of financial risks that may be familiar to those of you in the financial sector or in risk management, such as market risk, liquidity risk, underwriting risk, credit risk, operational risk, and counterparty risk. So now I'd like to briefly introduce the concept of scenario analysis and scenario planning. What is scenario analysis? Scenario analysis, here I've cited a definition from the US Army Corps of Engineers that I think is quite helpful. It says, scenarios are divergent stories about the future. The story format allows people and organizations to envision possible future consequences of complex interactions among economic, political, social, and environmental forces. Scenarios are not predictions of the future, and in most cases, the scenarios are not likely to occur exactly as written, but they do need to be plausible. They describe events which could happen, which might happen. They are designed to take an outside-in focus, beginning with external forces and ending with internal actions that the organization might need to take to prepare for and cope with the eventualities depicted in the scenarios. The idea is to focus on the issues most relevant to the missions of the organization. So there's a lot to unpack there. You know, in the interest of time, I think I'm not going to probably give you the time that you need to fully digest everything that's there. But suffice it to say, scenarios are about constructing pathways of what future society may look like, and then extrapolating from that for purposes of managing the key issues and challenges that are important to you as a stakeholder of a company, of a government, or of some kind of an entity. And the terminology here can get a bit confusing. I distinguish scenario analysis from scenario planning in the end objective. They're essentially the same thing through the analysis step, but the planning is what turns that insight from the process into action, so that you then can beneficially use the insights gained from the scenario construction and analysis process for planning and strategic action. Those are often done together, but not necessarily. Where did scenario planning and scenario analysis come from? This is actually not a new domain. It has its beginnings in the 1940s, but was prominently adopted and promoted in the 1960s and 70s by the oil company Royal Dutch Shell, which had an internal team focused on scenario planning as a means, first and foremost, to anticipate dynamics in the oil industry, which became extremely valuable as the 1970s oil crises unfolded. And we can see that this is really distinct from the traditional strategic planning process in that you don't necessarily presume that the current conditions are going to pervade in the future, or even that you have a single quote unquote official future, right? Where certain assumptions about the future are taken as given. Instead, they develop different scenarios in which the cost of oil took different trajectories and used that as a planning tool that was really revolutionary at the time. And it was increasingly recognized as a critical planning tool that dramatically strengthened the strategic planning of the organization. Scenario analysis and scenario planning was further popularized in the late 1980s and 1990s, prominently by the Global Business Network, one of the founders of which, Peter Schwartz, wrote a famous monograph called The Art of the Long View, Planning for the Future in an Uncertain World, that dates to 1996. The Global Business Network, later Monitor Consulting, were very prominent advocates. And for a time, this scenario analysis became quite widely integrated into strategic planning and into business consulting, although it did subsequently lose some of its luster in the digital era, where there's been a greater focus on quantitative analysis. Now getting into current approaches of scenario analysis. I'd like to first distinguish between three related but distinct types of scenario analysis. One is financial stress testing, which is targeting specifically the financial sector. It is meant to assess the adequacy of capital on balance sheets to withstand market shocks and downturns. It is typically driven by regulators of financial markets whose responsibility is macro financial stability, and also often to oversee the stability of systemically important financial institutions that they regulate. And so this is a very particular type of scenario analysis, whereby a set of adverse conditions are typically pre-established for the purpose of the scenario by the regulators, and then those scenarios are used to stress test the balance sheets of a bank or financial institution. That is one prominent type of scenario analysis. It is not the same thing as scenario analysis, and there are many types of scenario analysis that are not stress tests. So I wanted to make that clear, that it is a Venn diagram, right, where most stress testing is a kind of scenario analysis, but not all scenario analysis is stress testing. Among other kinds of scenario analysis are scenarios conducted for risk management. Those scenarios are designed to improve the operational and financial risk management of an institution and to build organizational readiness and resilience. So one can think about that sort of scenario analysis as the purview of the chief risk officer, something that the risk management function is seeking to do to ensure that the risk management function within the institution is robust, with an eye towards the future, particularly emerging risks or dynamic risks that may impact the organization differently in the future than they do today, which would necessitate or recommend the use of scenarios whereby one might change the assumptions about the organization's operating environment. What might be different in the future, and how would that impact the practice of prudent risk management? The third category, and I should mention these are not all necessarily mutually exclusive. In fact, they're often done together or should be done together. The third category is strategic planning. And so one can think about this exercise as most concerning the board or the management of an organization, as an exercise in establishing and pursuing the strategic direction of an organization. Here, we're focused not necessarily on risk per se, but on uncertainty. And if there's anything I think we can agree on regarding climate change in the future, is that there are many uncertainties that face the natural world, the economy, human society, impacts on our ecosystems, and on human behavior and how society is going to increasingly respond to these challenges going forward. Some of those things have been established with high degrees of certainty. They may be very risky, but they may not be that uncertain. And so there are other aspects of our world, our economy, our living and operating environment that are highly uncertain. And it is very difficult to engage in decision-making and business planning, strategic planning in uncertain environments. But that's the nature of our world. And embracing that uncertainty and grappling with it is critical for that strategic planning to be robust and to create readiness and responsiveness to those potential different futures. It also is very helpful for identifying both risks and opportunities, and then subsequently incorporating them into the strategic planning process. So scenarios are quite good for that. I'd like to now talk about scenarios as they're currently practiced. I'm going to have to run through this section fairly quickly, for which I apologize, but I think we can use a lot of these next slides as references and return to them in the Q&A if there's interest in a deeper dive. It's important to mention that much of the current practice around climate scenario analysis is being driven by the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, which was launched as a voluntary effort by industry, partially under the auspices of the G7's Financial Stability Board in 2017, and has very quickly grown to become a global effort that is essentially the gold standard for establishing certain terminology, common understanding, and common approaches for climate risks and opportunities, the management of those climate-related risks, particularly financial risks, and the disclosure of those risks to the general public, in financial disclosures, to regulators, and so forth. And it's important to note that this, though it has become embraced by regulators, began as a voluntary initiative of industry. It also is not limited to the financial sector. Even though it is about financial risk, it is applied broadly by corporates for their financial disclosures. And in fact, there are many government and non-corporate entities that have also embraced, supported, and are disclosing under the TCFD framework. The TCFD framework was initially launched by Mark Carney, the former head of the Bank of England, pictured below, and Michael Bloomberg, former mayor of New York City, and special envoy to the UN for climate. Both major figures in the climate change and financial worlds, and they have helped to bring the TCFD to prominence. The TCFD has 4 pillars: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And it, in 2017, as part of its launch, released 11 recommendations tethered to these 4 pillars, of which one of the strategy recommendations was describe the resilience of the company's strategy, taking into consideration different climate-related scenarios, including a 2-degree or lower scenario. And so that, is, in many respects, was the starting gun to the practice by industry and the financial sector of climate-related scenario analysis. It was enshrined as a recommendation, that this broader suite of recommendations and frameworks has caught on like wildfire, as I showed on the previous page. There roughly 4,000 entities that have signed on to supporting and disclosing according to the TCFD guidelines. And many regulators have done so as well, as I'll show in a moment. So because scenario analysis is part of that, as part of that suite, scenario analysis has quickly entered the mainstream in a very short time since 2017. And TCFD has indeed issued some guidelines. I've shown a couple of their main publications on scenario analysis on the screen here that have helped to accelerate the adoption of climate-related scenario analysis. What they propose to do is, once governance is in place, is to engage in a series of steps, including the assessment of the materiality of climate-related risks, identifying and defining a range of scenarios that have different parameters relevant both to climate and to financial impacts on the organization, evaluating the business impacts, and then identifying potential responses. So it's hard to overemphasize the breadth of the scope of TCFD alignment amongst financial regulators and overseers. In this map of the world, I have plotted a number of the regulators and financial oversight bodies that have aligned themselves with TCFD. It's really almost everyone who matters, to be honest. I have not marked India on here. I prepared this slide last year, but just in the last several weeks, the head of the Reserve Bank of India also announced that India will be preparing climate-related scenarios and stress tests amongst a broader suite of climate-related risk and disclosure guidelines for the financial sector. I have not looked into those in great detail yet, but I believe that they are also TCFD aligned. So this is not a comprehensive set, but you can see almost any prominent global financial regulator has now aligned with TCFD. A brief timeline of the adoption of some of these steps. Starting in 2020, the Bank of England prominently announced its CBES climate scenario exercise with UK banks and insurers. In 2021, the Bank of International Settlements, a sort of a global entity providing guidance for the financial sector, recommended robust forward-looking climate risk management for financial stability. That key phrase, forward-looking, typically means that scenarios are necessary because it requires the setting of conditions that are the underlying assumptions for that future, forward-looking future. In 2021, the European Central Bank announced a stress test, which was conducted last year. In fall of last year, the Financial Stability Board explicitly recommended scenario analysis and stress testing. And after an initial announcement in September of last year, the US Federal Reserve launched a climate scenario analysis pilot with the 6 largest banks in the US last month in January that will be underway throughout the first half of this year. I've already mentioned the Bank of International Settlements, and in the 2021 report that it released, it emphasized that supervisors need to ensure adequate management of climate-related and environmental risks, and that these risks cut across various financial risk categories, and that effective supervision requires the use of forward-looking assessments of institutions' risk profiles. I'm going to skip through these slides here because we're short on time, but this is referencing the ECB and Bank of England work on climate scenarios. A nice phrase here from a speech by a then senior member of the Bank of England, Anil Kashyap. My big takeaway is that the private sector firms have a big risk management problem regarding climate risk. It is the job of supervisors to assess the size of the problem and work with the industry to address it. And you can see here that the scenarios developed by the Bank of England included carbon prices of varying levels coming online at different times and different degrees of warming up to 30 years out in the future. I've already mentioned here that the Financial Stability Board emphasized the importance to consider a range of financial risks as part of these macroprudential oversight exercises covering physical and transition risk, and making sure that these are system-wide. Here are some more details on the US Fed climate scenario analysis that was recently announced and is now underway. I'm going to run through those very quickly. So there's some sobering news to this as well. This has been adopted very, very quickly, and it is not easy to do. In the latest progress report of the TCFD released last October, the particular recommendation around resilience of strategy, in other words, the item that's related to scenario analysis, has the very lowest level of compliance and disclosure amongst all 11 TCFD recommendations. This is hard stuff to do, and people don't really know how to do it yet. That is consistent across regions. It was particularly low in the North American region where I reside. It's also noteworthy that in the financial sector, there has been very low compliance and widespread challenges around the conduct of scenario analysis for climate disclosures. And that is seen that only 16% of companies, even in 2021, the most recent year surveyed, were including the resilience of strategy and scenario analysis amongst their disclosures. And that is by far the lowest of any of these recommendations. So this is an area where there's a lot of hard work ahead. It's also worth noting that the scenarios that are being used, which I'm going to speak to very briefly before we go to the Q&A, have some shortcomings. They have been noted to likely understate the exposure and vulnerability of the institutions to climate-related risks. The metrics are often not capturing second-order effects, non-linearities, potential future externalities from climate risk management. This is from, by the way, the official report of the Financial Stability Board and the Network for Greening the Financial System, or NGFS, which is a grouping of central banks, over 100 central banks and financial oversight bodies around the world, and that has promulgated the policy climate scenarios that are most widely adopted. And so they themselves are recognizing that those scenarios have some important deficiencies. They often lack adequate data. There are limitations to the modeling. And there's a suspicion that these limitations may significantly understate actual climate-related risks and impact. And that is really the punchline that leads us to this discipline of narrative-driven scenarios that help to address some of these limitations and shortcomings of the quantitative scenarios based on models that are currently in use. So I'm going to have to run through this very quickly. I realize this is very hard to digest quickly, but I want to make sure we leave adequate time for Q&A, and maybe we can delve deeper in subsequent sessions into some of these details. But in brief, how is it that scenario analysis actually helps to manage uncertainty, and where do the narratives come in? Let me focus the next several minutes on that before opening up for Q&A. So what do scenarios do? Scenarios challenge assumptions. They build new integrative mental models for the future that embrace uncertainty. They do not require consensus amongst the participants developing and analyzing the scenarios as to which scenario is the quote unquote correct one. And they build strategic flexibility and the ability to engage in adaptive management to to manage the uncertain timing of the onset of many of these future conditions. This is a snapshot from the NGFS portal on climate scenarios. And this illustrates the uncertainty visually in a way that I think is helpful. You can see here in the top right, we have the curve of historical global net carbon dioxide emissions, and up to the present, up to about 2021. And you see many different curves and trajectories for those emissions going forward, depending on how human society responds to the climate challenge. And the amount that our world warms in the future is very heavily dependent on that societal reaction. And so climate scenarios typically are built around those longer term trajectories for emissions and for the warming that will ensue based upon those level of emissions decades out into the future. You can see that the most widespread assumptions and scenarios look at a band of 1.4 degrees to 3 degrees centigrade of warming, which is quite wide. We're already today at 1.1 degrees centigrade. 1.4 is really a best case scenario, or even better than best case. There are many scenarios where there's quite a great deal of additional warming in store. And those have ramifications that are rather frightening to behold, and would bring us into conditions of our natural world that humanity has never experienced in its history. And then there's everything in between. And so the NGFS scenarios look at various aspects of that transition and the natural world, and seek then to determine various different possible futures and how those would impact the business and the financial community. And I don't really have time to go into detail here, but one way to do that is to plot these scenarios according to the magnitude of the transition risks, low to high, and the physical risks, low to high. And that's a 2x2 matrix is an interesting way to think about that and conceptualize it. I'll note briefly that these scenarios, as designed, are scenarios based on a series of models. You have the transition pathways, which are integrated assessment models from the field of economics. Those then impact the amount of emissions and then go into natural systems and climate modeling, as well as natural catastrophe modeling for short-term acute climate impacts. And then you have global macroeconomic models for macro financial impacts used by regulators. And these are then downscaled for purposes of use by individual businesses through geospatial overlays of financial portfolios, looking at individual geographies, sectors, asset types, and other parameters such as timescale and the specifics of a scenario. And then, of course, the risk transmission pathways also need to be considered. This is for scenario planning and assessment as it's done today, typically by financial institutions. The main steps are planning, data sourcing, scenario development, impact analysis, and then the outcome, which could be regulatory reporting, or it could be it could be public disclosure, or it could be other internal uses. A couple words very briefly on narrative before we transition to Q&A. Again, apologies for the rapid clip here.
Mr. Ide, if I can, you could
Yes.
take a bit more time on this, because this does look like the meaty part of the presentation. So please, if you could spend a bit more time on this. Yes.
I will. Okay. So we can see here that the NGFS approach, which has these nested quantitative modeling elements, is very dependent on that one methodology, right? These models have been critically important for raising the profile and for really understanding, in many respects, the magnitude of the challenge and the scope of the challenge. I think it's reasonable to pose the question, what might these models be missing at any of these steps. And we don't need to get into the details here to recognize that anyone familiar with modeling recognizes that it has particular use cases, right? And that it is necessarily constrained by certain limitations. Amongst the limitations of modeling is often a difficulty to anticipate behavior of complex systems and cascading impacts. They often do not anticipate tail events very well, so extreme risks or departures from the status quo or from the historical record. And so anything that is disruptive to the baseline scenario can often go overlooked. And once a system is disrupted, the previous models may no longer be entirely applicable. And one way to think about this in concrete terms is to think about some of the shocks that we've experienced in recent years related to COVID-19 or human events, such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the impacts that that has had on financial markets and on commodities markets. Those were broadly unforeseen events that were not incorporated in most models of this nature. And yet they've had very, very broad ripple effects across the world. And I think it's fair to state that climate can have similarly broad and far-reaching consequences. And those are quite plausible, and yet they don't tend to be captured in models such as these. So that is one of the real essential values of scenarios, is being able to construct these plausible eventualities and think about what those consequences might be and how the world would respond to it, including in the political realm, in societal realm, in areas that do ultimately impact our lives, but are difficult to capture in models. So what is the exercise of scenario planning really about? It needs to have a number of key qualities in developing scenarios. They need to be relevant, plausible, illuminating, provocative, and actionable for them to really have value as an exercise. This, by the way, is a list that was prepared by a group called the Real World Climate Scenarios Roundtable last year. And they identified a 7-step planning process for defining the objective of the exercise, identifying the external drivers of the scenarios. In other words, in a scenario, are you focusing on impact in the physical world like sea level rise? Are you looking at a near-term event like a wildfire or a flood or a drought? You then assess the drivers that are the centerpiece of your scenario. You define the specifics of the scenario, how many years out, what time horizon, what is the geographic scope, what are the sectors, what are the other assumptions you're making about economic growth, about policy, about financial markets, and so on and so forth. You develop the narratives in detail, often with prose narrative, not just with numbers, but to actually have a plausible causal flow of events, right? Where one thing leads to another in a way that can be explained and rationalized and lead to certain outcomes that may not be a priori evident or obvious, but would be material for the institution. You then quantify those scenarios to try to really assess what those impacts would be. And then you embed those results in decision-making through strategic planning, through risk management, or through other relevant processes. So another methodology that has many similarities, though some slight differences, is from the Scenario Planning for Climate Change Guide, published by Nardia Haig in 2019. She very much emphasizes the process within an institution for actually conducting this, which I think is quite helpful, whereby there is an agenda setting exercise, there is an identification of key stakeholders, both within the organization who will engage in the scenario planning exercise, as well as external stakeholders who may participate to consult or who are simply relevant actors in the institution's ecosystem, whose vantage point should also be considered, right? Let's say, you are a bank in India, right? And you have a scenario envisioning a recession that is driven by climate-related factors. You don't just care what happens to your bank, you care how is the regulator going to respond to that? How are your competitors going to respond to that? How are your customers going to respond to that? And those then need to be integrated in a dynamic fashion into the scenario exercise. And those are really hallmarks of good scenarios, is to consider, those 360-degree aspects of the major actors in the system, as well as the features of the system itself in the given constructed scenario, so that it is really quite robust and realistic. And then there's the identification of the driving forces, development of the scenario, and then she also emphasizes the identification of warning signs, which I think is quite helpful as a decision planning tool. Because it helps to anticipate when a particular scenario or variant thereof may be arriving. You may be able to to diagnose or to identify the onset of a scenario in the real world by identifying warning signs that can show up to say, yes, this is actually happening as we envisioned it, because we see the precursors of that unfolding. In terms of some of those elements for scenario construction, one helpful framework for developing those scenarios is known as the STEEP framework, which captures these 5 domains of drivers for scenarios: social, technological, economic, ecological, and political legal. We don't have time to go into all these in detail, but you can see here that one can go very deep in terms of the intricacies of the scenarios, thinking about what might drive some of the key operating conditions of this future world, and would be material for the strategic planning and risk management of our institution in that future world. And so there are many methodologies for incorporating these different elements, and then to try to then rank order and prioritize those that are most important for a handful of scenarios that one might then construct and focus on, which can incorporate any number of these, though typically an exercise towards the beginning of the scenario construction attempts to focus on those that are of the greatest importance. One way to think about this, here's another 2x2 matrix prepared by Mark Cliff, one of the founders of the Real World Climate Scenarios Roundtable. His particular framework for developing a handful of scenarios has high to low policy intervention on one axis, and market dynamism on the other axis, high to low. And then he has used that to construct a series of 4 frameworks, all of which are developed around narratives. So these are not only distinct from real world, the NGFS scenarios, in that he has a slightly different matrix, but these are narrative driven and they're more focused on the near term, which is often quite useful for business planning on a time frame that's more aligned with business strategy cycles. One other thing that I'll note before I close here there are many different nuances for the scenario development exercise, and that can be adjusted in the methodology. Those include inductive versus deductive scenario exercises, whether one starts with the risk or a problem or a potential outcome, and then try to reverse engineer the causes and triggers and devise interventions that can mitigate those risks or produce solutions. Or one might start with a driver and then you engage in an exercise to say, where would this driver take us? And then you don't necessarily predetermine a situation like, say, a recession or some kind of a crisis. You say, we see these steep drivers as essential for the future, but we don't know until we conduct the exercise what we think our scenario will entail. There are other ways to focus on risk management versus uncertainty, depending on whether one is more concerned with the likelihood of material risk or more concerned with the uncertainty of the onset of a risk, which are not the same thing. And so those are important distinguishing features in terms of the design of a scenario analysis exercise. There's, again, exploration versus prediction related to this risk management versus uncertainty. Prediction does, of course, ultimately require a degree of convergence among the team engaging in the scenario exercise. Exploration does not. And so one can come up with a number of plausible scenarios without determining which of them necessarily is most likely to occur. And then there's simply analytical, which is the scenario analysis I was discussing, versus scenario planning, which is explicitly using those scenarios for business purposes, right? Which is often how they're most valuable, but it really depends on what the purpose of the exercise is. And that purpose in turn informs the design of the exercise itself. And then finally, it's important to note the distinction between business and policy scenarios. Business scenarios being ones where the ultimate end use is to benefit the risk management or strategic position of a particular entity, versus a scenario that is meant to be economy-wide, really top-down instead of bottom-up, that a policymaker would use or a central banker would use to say, what are the conditions going to be for society as a whole? And those do entail some distinctive design features. Now, to conclude and to transition to the Q&A, let me just end here with a few concluding remarks. First of all, scenario analysis has been embraced by policymakers in industry as a critical tool for managing and disclosing climate-related risks and opportunities. This has unfolded extremely rapidly since the release of the TCFD recommendations in 2017, but is now mainstream. And so virtually any country now with a large economy and financial market is likely to be considering or have already adopted some form of climate scenario analysis. Second of all, climate scenario analysis and planning are critical for managing uncertainty around possible disruptive and extreme climate-related events. There simply is no other way to deal with an uncertain future where we appreciate that the world of even the near future, let alone several decades hence, is going to look very different from the world today. Climate science has established that beyond a shadow of a doubt. And so we need tools to allow us to manage that uncertainty. Third of all, climate scenario analysis is a young, rapidly evolving field that is facing challenges and limitations related to methodology, data availability, deep uncertainty, and limited experience and expertise amongst practitioners. So there's a certain humility that's really needed in approaching this field, recognizing that we're new at this, it's difficult, and we don't have a lot of experience at it. And so we need an open mind, and we need to reckon with the limitations of our current approaches and consider new ones. And finally, approaches that preference narratives for scenario construction, for example, to envision near-term crises and stress events, can better prepare market actors and build their readiness and resilience for the future. So thank you very much. I will stop there, and I am eager to take your questions.
Siddharth, you're on mute.
Sorry.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you for that presentation, Mr. Ayad. I'll get into this questions. I have 3 questions from Ms. Laura Zamboni. The first question is, what are the scenarios good for? No model is perfect. All are wrong or some are useful. So what is the usefulness of these scenario analysis here?
Thank you for that question. So I think it really comes down to what is the purpose of the use of the scenario, right? And you can think back to the three types and use cases that I spoke to earlier in the presentation. There's a financial stress test, there is the risk management exercise, and there's the strategic planning exercise. I think the easiest one to envision in sort of a concrete way is as a stress test, right? And if the goal is to examine the financial resilience of an institution in the instance of a downturn or a shock, one needs to be able to anticipate a downturn or a shock that is realistic. And so the challenge with defining realistic when you're dealing with a dynamic set of circumstances that have not occurred in the past and in the historical record is we need to be imaginative and creative and think about shocks and downturns that could occur driven by these climate drivers that have not occurred in the past. And so the models do that very well in certain respects. The climate models for the longer term, looking at levels of warming, I think have been proven fairly robust. Certainly, we can use financial modeling that extrapolates impacts on key macroeconomic conditions, such as growth rate, interest rate, unemployment, and so forth. But in terms of other shocks that occur as a result of very extreme disruptive events, right? Or say political events, take Brexit, or in the United States, the election of Donald Trump, right? Or you have the an election that leads to a either climate friendly or climate unfriendly administration that may take very different policies. Those things are not typically incorporated into the models that are used by NGFS, for example. It takes an analog approach of scenario development to really think about the types of things that could happen and how they would impact societal conditions and a given business or entity, and then to calculate the quantitative impact once those conditions have been envisioned. And so those don't necessarily have to be right. They're not necessarily better than the models. They're an alternative to the models. And so what they do is they allow the customization and the expansion of scenarios beyond what the models actually can posit, in a way that allows us to think more broadly about the real risks that we face and to prepare and plan for them accordingly.
Thank you. There are two further questions from Ms. Zamboni. So maybe, we're almost towards the end. Perhaps if you could give us a quick view on that. So what she asks is academic literature in finance included in defining these guidelines? Or is this exercise siloed only within practitioners? And what kind of an expertise is missed in defining such guidelines? Quickly, if you could, kindly.
That's a great question. I would say today, the field of scenario analysis practitioners is quite siloed. I think right now, most of the leading practitioners tend to be either, or certainly of narratives of management under deep uncertainty, of adaptive management, and also climate adaptation and adaptation pathways. Those tend to be primarily in academia, think tanks, and the public sector. And then there is the modeling and scenario analysis that's increasingly being conducted by central banks and financial oversight bodies. That tends to, so it's growing in adoption. It does not to date tend to incorporate much of this work around narratives. And so there is stovepiping. And I would say in neither case have these scenario approaches frequently been adopted by C-suites or boards to really be incorporated into strategic planning, which is where you would really see an impact on the behavior of institutions, right? To think about these less conventionally understood or anticipated events and use those as drivers of business planning, right? I would argue that that is not being done very widely, and that is bespeaks a lack of readiness and resilience across the broader world, right? The business community, the policy community, government, and so forth, because we need to be ready for these unexpected shocks and disruptions that we know in many respects are coming, but we haven't done the hard work of envisioning what they might actually look like and anticipating how we would react in those contexts.
Okay, I think we are towards the end, but perhaps I could get one final question in the way. So we have Mr. R.K. Anand asking, what are the major bases underlying for planning scenarios on metrics and targets for banks in context of climate risk management? Major bases underlying for planning scenarios on the metrics and targets for the banks, especially focused at banks.
So let me see if I understand the question properly. I think that for metrics and targets, a lot of the work today is focused around net zero and decarbonization on the transition risk side and on transition planning. So that isn't just banks, of course, where that transition risk resides in the portfolio assets primarily, rather than in the operations, as it does for corporates and entities in the real economy. And so thinking about the metrics surrounding financed emissions and around value at risk from transition risk that is associated with those portfolio assets, scenarios can focus on those particular items. But I think there are a lot of other elements at play here, right? I think what's important to assess the value at risk, for example, is the methodology for assessing that value at risk. And, if you're taking a, 95% confidence interval, what is the distribution that you're using to set that 95% threshold, right? And what are the assumptions for those economic conditions, and what models are you using? Because not to say those are wrong, but as we know, all models are, right? Some models are useful. And so we need to think about, are those models that we are using for calculating VAR, and then whatever other metrics and targets we're tracking, those metrics are only as good as the underlying assumptions in the models and methodologies that are being used to derive those. And it may be of value to pressure test those using different assumptions and inputs into those models, or different methodologies entirely, right? That allow you to better capture different operating environments. And so one can talk about different metrics themselves. I think it's hard at this point to say what exactly is the standard. One of the things I really glossed over is that different regulators have established different conditions for stress tests and scenario exercises. So there is a lot of really detailed specifics that individual national regulators have developed to sort of customize the NGFS or the TCFD to their national contexts and for specific exercises. So that is a very long conversation where you'd have to take a specific jurisdiction in many cases. But speaking generally, one can say, you have these standard risk metrics, or you have these standard financial performance metrics, or ESG and climate performance metrics, right, around decarbonization. And one then can calculate those in the context of different scenarios and use those to assess how would we perform if we end up in a world like X or a world like Y that has these different conditions.
Okay.
Right. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you for that, Mr. Rai. So I do have some follow-up questions, but perhaps I can, email it to you, and perhaps there might be you could answer to them some over an email, perhaps later on. But we have really short over time. So thank you so much for your presentation. We can see a lot of effort has gone into it. There's large amount of graphics and insightful data inside that. So perhaps whatever that you could share is whatever is possible, you could kindly do the same. And I would thank everyone, all the participants for staying until the very end. And thank you so much, Mr. Ryle, once again for taking the time to give this presentation this evening, this today. So it's morning there, evening here. Yes. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me and for everyone's attention. I really
Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.